My name is Vivian. I am 30 years old, and last month my stepmother auctioned off my grandmother Victoria's $1.1 million jewelry collection. She stood in front of Dallas High Society smiling for the cameras and told everyone the pieces were her personal inheritance. She even spent the $250,000 cash advance on a new sports car before the auction floor even opened. She thought I was just the exhausted, overworked veterinary clinic manager who would quietly step aside and let her erase my family history. She thought I had no power. She had no idea about the small wooden box my grandmother left for me in a downtown Austin bank vault. She had no idea that when the head appraiser saw the wax seal inside that box, he would stop the bidding cold, turn on his microphone, and ask her exactly where she got those diamonds. Before I tell you what happened when the auction house locked the doors, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Calm Senior Stories. Drop a comment below telling me your age and where you are watching from today. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the night my father had his stroke, the exact night my stepmother decided to rob us blind. The Morgan Ranch sits on 40 acres just outside of Austin. It was supposed to be a working ranch, but ever since my dad married Brenda 10 years ago, it became more of a country club backdrop for her social media photos. I was 20 when Brenda moved in with her teenage daughter, Madison. From day one, the dynamic was set in stone. Madison was the golden child who needed designer clothes to fit in, and I was the built-in ranch hand who needed to learn the value of hard work. Last Tuesday started like any other brutal shift at the veterinary clinic. I was managing the front desk, coordinating surgeries, and running on 4 hours of sleep. Then my phone rang. It was the local hospital. My dad, David, had suffered a mild stroke and was being admitted to the ICU. I dropped everything. I left my job in the middle of a shift and drove straight to the hospital. When I got to his room, my dad was pale and hooked up to monitors. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was the only sound in the room. I sat by his bed for 3 straight days. I slept in a plastic waiting room chair that bruised my ribs. I talked to the neurologists. I managed his medication schedule and made sure the nurses knew about his allergies. Do you know where Brenda was during those 72 hours? She stopped by on this first afternoon for 20 minutes. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt and complained that the hospital coffee was stale. She stood at the foot of his bed checking her watch and told my dad she had a charity committee meeting she could not miss. She patted my shoulder, told me to hold the fort, and walked out. Madison did not show up at all. I was left alone to watch my father breathe, terrified I might lose him. On the morning of the 4th day, the doctors finally downgraded my dad from the ICU. He was stabilizing. His speech was slurred, but he squeezed my hand. The nurses told me to go home, take a shower, and sleep in a real bed for a few hours. I drove back to the ranch feeling a strange mix of relief and bone-deep exhaustion. My eyes burned from the lack of sleep. The house was quiet when I unlocked the front door. Brenda's SUV was gone. The grand foyer smelled like her expensive floral perfume, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic smell of the hospital that clung to my clothes. I walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen, untying my work boots. That was when I felt something sharp under my sock. I stopped and looked down. Resting against the edge of the hallway runner rug was a small piece of metal. I bent down and picked it up. My breath caught in my throat. It was an earring back. But not just any earring back. It was heavy vintage platinum shaped in a distinctive floral pattern. I knew exactly where it belonged. It belonged to my grandmother Victoria's diamond chandelier earrings. My grandmother was a fierce Texas woman. She built her wealth through smart land investments when no one else took her seriously. Her jewelry collection was the only thing of real value left in our family, a physical timeline of her success. It was appraised at over $1 million. For years, the collection sat locked inside the wall safe in my dad's home office. Brenda had always complained about it. She used to tell my dad it was a shame to keep all that money locked in the dark when they could use it to upgrade the kitchen or take vacations to Europe. My dad always said no. The jewelry was meant for me. My hands started to shake. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold spike of adrenaline. I walked down the hall to my dad's office. The heavy oak door was pushed open. I stepped inside and looked at the wall behind his desk. The framed painting of the Texas Hill Country that usually covered the safe was pulled aside and resting on the floor. The digital safe door hung wide open. I stood there staring into the empty steel box. The green velvet display cases were gone. The diamond necklaces, the sapphire rings, the platinum earrings, all of it, gone. The shelves were wiped bare. In the very moment my father was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke, his wife did not stay to hold his hand. She went home, unlocked his safe, and cleared out my legacy. She used a family medical emergency as a cover to rob me. I sank into the leather chair behind the desk, feeling the cold weight of the vintage earring back in my palm. The silence in the house felt suffocating. I knew Brenda was greedy, but I never imagined she was capable of something this calculated. I stared at the empty safe, realizing that my fight was just beginning. I sat in the dark at the granite kitchen island for 2 hours. The platinum earring back dug into my palm. The house was dead quiet. I did not turn on the lights. I just watched the driveway through the large bay windows. Around 7 in the evening, the headlights of Brenda's luxury SUV swept across the front lawn. I listened to the heavy oak front door click open. Brenda walked in, humming a soft tune, her arms loaded with shopping bags from a high-end boutique in downtown Austin. She flicked on the hallway lights and jumped when she saw me sitting in the shadows. "Vivian, what on earth are you doing lurking in the dark?" she snapped, dropping her bags on the entryway bench. I stood up slowly. I walked into the light of the foyer and held out my hand, opening my fingers so she could see the vintage metal backing. "Where is my grandmother's jewelry, Brenda?" I expected panic. I expected her to stutter or invent a story about moving the pieces to a safer location. Instead, she let out a long, theatrical sigh. She walked right past me into the kitchen, pulled a crystal wine glass from the cabinet, and opened the refrigerator. "I was wondering when you would go snooping," she said, pouring herself a generous glass of Chardonnay. "That safe belongs to my father, and the contents belong to me," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Where are they?" Brenda took a sip of her wine and leaned against the marble counter. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Your grandmother and I had a long talk before she passed away, Vivian. She realized how much I do for this family. She knew I appreciated the finer things in life. She gifted that collection to me." The lie was so bold, so detached from reality, that for a second I could not even process the words. My grandmother Victoria despised Brenda. Victoria was a woman who built her own fortune from the ground up. She saw right through Brenda's polished, status-obsessed facade from the moment my dad brought her to the ranch. I remembered our last family Thanksgiving before Victoria died. Brenda had tried to compliment Victoria's pearl necklace, hinting that she would love to borrow it for a country club gala. Victoria looked Brenda up and down and said across a table of 12 people that her jewelry would only be worn by women who actually earned their keep. Victoria did not even allow Brenda to call her by her first name. "She gifted it to you?" I repeated, my voice shaking with a cold fury. "My grandmother would not have trusted you with a plastic ring from a vending machine, let alone a $1 million heritage collection." Brenda's eyes narrowed. The polite country club smile dropped. "You are just upset because you always felt entitled to things you never worked for. Your father and I discussed it. The pieces are mine now. It is a closed subject." She turned her back to me, picked up her wine, and walked toward the master staircase, leaving her leather designer purse and a stack of mail scattered across the kitchen island. I stood alone in the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked over to the island, staring at the pile of mail she had tossed aside. Sticking out from beneath her purse was a thick, glossy booklet. The paper was heavy, the kind used for high society invitations. I pulled it out. The cover was matte black with silver-embossed lettering. It read, "Sterling and Hayes Luxury Auctions, Dallas, Texas. Fall Preview Event." I flipped the booklet open. My stomach dropped. It was a catalog for an upcoming private auction scheduled for the end of the month. I turned the pages, my eyes scanning the high-definition photographs of emerald pendants, vintage watches, and estate diamonds. Then I saw it. Spanning an entire 2-page spread was a photograph of my grandmother's platinum chandelier earrings, the exact ones matching the backing I held in my hand. The text beneath the photo described the lot as a highly anticipated private estate liquidation. Brenda was not just holding the jewelry to wear it. She was liquidating my history. She was fencing $1 million legacy to fund her lifestyle, and she was fast-tracking the sale before my father even made it out of the hospital. I did not sleep that night. At sunrise, I drove straight back to the hospital. My dad had been moved to a standard recovery room. He was sitting up in bed eating a cup of fruit, looking tired but alert. I needed him to be the father I remembered from my childhood. I needed him to protect our family legacy. I sat down in the chair next to his bed. "Dad, we have a serious problem. Brenda emptied the wall safe while you were in the ICU. She took all of Grandma's jewelry, and I found an auction catalog in the kitchen. She is trying to sell everything in Dallas." I waited for the shock. I waited for the anger. I waited for him to reach for his cell phone and call his wife to demand answers. Instead, my father let out a heavy, rattling sigh. He put his plastic spoon down and refused to meet my eyes. He stared at the blank television screen mounted on the wall. "Brenda warned me you might come in here causing a scene," he said, his voice weak but laced with irritation. The room suddenly felt very cold. Causing a scene. "Dad, she stole $1 million worth of family heirlooms. She robbed us." "She did not steal anything," my dad muttered, rubbing his forehead. "She told me she was securing the valuables. With me being in the hospital, she was worried about security at the ranch. And yes, we talked about liquidating a few of the older pieces. The maintenance on the property is high, Vivian. Your stepmother has been under a lot of stress managing everything." I stared at the man in the hospital bed, realizing I did not recognize him anymore. He was making excuses for a thief. He was choosing the comfort of a lie over the difficult truth. Brenda had isolated him, fed his ego, and convinced him that her spending habits were just the cost of keeping a beautiful wife happy. "She is selling Grandma's legacy," I pleaded, leaning closer. "Dad, Grandma wanted me to have those pieces. You know that. You promised me." My father finally turned to look at me, and his expression was hard. "Stop being greedy over old trinkets, Vivian. You have a job. You can buy your own jewelry. Do not come into my hospital room and attack my wife when I'm trying to recover from a stroke. I want you to drop the subject, now." The betrayal felt physical, like a sharp blow to the chest. He was acting as the ultimate enabler, shielding the abuser while punishing the victim for pointing out the abuse. I stood up from the plastic chair. I did not argue. I did not cry. Crying would only give him the satisfaction of dismissing me as emotional. "Okay, Dad," I said quietly. "Rest well." I walked out of the hospital room and navigated the bright fluorescent hallways until I reached the parking garage. I sat in the driver's seat of my beat-up Honda Civic and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The isolation crashed over me in waves. The ranch was not my home anymore. It was enemy territory. My father was not my protector. He was a willing hostage who had handed over the keys to his own kingdom. I was entirely alone. Brenda held the assets, she held the narrative, and she held my father's permission. She thought she had neatly tied up every loose end. She thought she had boxed me into a corner where my only option was to surrender and watch her parade my grandmother's diamonds across the Dallas auction block. The reality of my situation was sinking in. My family viewed me as a nuisance, an obstacle to their wealth, rather than a daughter with rightful claims to her heritage. But as I started the engine of my car, the despair began to harden into something else, something sharp and unforgiving. Brenda thought liquidating a legacy was as simple as making a phone call to an auction house. She thought the money was already hers to spend. I had no idea just how fast she was moving or how deep her greed ran until I pulled back into the ranch driveway an hour later and saw exactly what she had done with the auction house cash advance. The afternoon sun beat down on the Texas asphalt as I steered my beat-up Honda Civic through the iron gates of the Morgan Ranch. The drive back from the hospital had been a blur of highway lines and rolling hills. My mind raced with the cold reality of my father dismissing my grandmother's stolen legacy as mere trinkets. I parked my car in its usual spot near the guest house, cutting the engine. The silence of the property offered no comfort. It felt hollow. Before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, the quiet was shattered by the deep, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. I looked in the rearview mirror. Kicking up a cloud of white dust down the long gravel driveway was a brand-new chalk-gray Porsche Macan. The vehicle gleamed in the sunlight, riding on custom black alloy wheels, flaunting temporary dealer tags on the back bumper. I stepped out of my car, my work boots crunching against the gravel, and watched as the luxury SUV rolled to a smooth stop right next to my 10-year-old sedan. The driver's side door swung open, releasing the rich scent of premium leather and expensive perfume. Out stepped Madison. My stepbrother did not exist. Madison was Brenda's only daughter, 24 years old, and the undisputed golden child of the Morgan household. While I spent my teenage years mucking stalls, managing livestock, and eventually working my way up to a clinic manager position, Madison spent hers curating a lifestyle online. She had never held a job for more than 3 weeks. Her excuses ranged from the lighting in the office giving her headaches to the managers being intimidated by her fashion sense. Brenda indulged every single delusion, funding Madison's salon appointments, designer wardrobes, and European ski trips. Madison was bred to consume, taught that the world owed her luxury simply for existing. Madison adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder. She spun a leather Porsche key fob around her index finger, the silver crest catching the light. She looked at the luxury vehicle, then slowly dragged her gaze over to my faded, dented Honda Civic. A slow, condescending smirk spread across her face. "It is a beauty, is it not?" Madison said, leaning against the polished driver's side door. "Custom interior, upgraded twin turbo." The dealership in Austin had it on the showroom floor. I told them I was not leaving without it. I stared at the car. A vehicle like that easily cost $120,000 off the lot. My father was strict about liquid assets, and his business accounts were currently locked down due to his hospitalization. Brenda's personal credit cards were routinely maxed out. "Where did you get the money for this?" I asked, my voice flat. Madison rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, dramatic sigh. "You are always so focused on money, Vivian. It is tacky. If you want nice things, maybe you should just work harder instead of smelling like wet dogs and antiseptic all day." Some of us actually know how to manifest our goals. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the hot Texas air. Work harder. I had just finished pulling a double shift managing emergency veterinary surgeries, followed by 3 sleepless nights, sitting in a hard plastic chair in the intensive care unit while she was likely getting a manicure. I took a step closer, ignoring the insult. "Answer the question, Madison." "Dad is lying in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke. His accounts are frozen pending a medical power of attorney. Neither you nor your mother have $120,000 in cash lying around." "How did you pay for this car?" Madison let out a high, dismissive laugh. She was arrogant, and her arrogance always made her sloppy with secrets. She thrived on rubbing her perceived superiority in my face. "I did not pay for it," she bragged, crossing her arms. "Mom bought it for me. A belated graduation present." "You dropped out of college 3 years ago," I pointed out. Madison waved a manicured hand in the air, brushing off the detail. "Whatever. The point is, Mom came into some money. A lot of money, actually. She signed a contract with Sterling and Hayes up in Dallas. They treated her like absolute royalty. They even gave her a VIP client advance just for choosing their auction house. $250,000 wired directly into her personal account yesterday morning. A signing bonus. She told me to go pick out whatever I wanted to celebrate. The numbers hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. $250,000. Brenda had not just stolen the $1 million jewelry collection. She had leveraged it. She took out $250,000 cash advance against my grandmother's legacy before the auction even began, and she spent it instantly. Within 24 hours of raiding the wall safe, Brenda had converted a piece of my heritage into a depreciating sports car to elevate her daughter's country club status. I stood paralyzed on the gravel, staring at the shiny gray paint of the Porsche. A wave of profound, suffocating despair washed over me. I pictured my grandmother Victoria. I remembered the stories of how she started out with nothing, scrubbing floors in downtown diners in the 1960s to save enough money to buy her first acre of Texas land. I remembered her rough, calloused hands. Every diamond, every sapphire, every piece of platinum in that safe represented decades of her grit, her survival, and her triumph over a world that told her she would never amount to anything. Victoria's jewelry was supposed to be my safety net. It was the physical manifestation of my grandmother's love kept safe so that I would never have to depend on a man like my father or endure the cruelty of a woman like Brenda. Now that sacred history was being rapidly consumed to fund the vain, empty lifestyle of a girl who could not even wake up before noon. I was being forced to watch my grandmother's legacy be transformed into status symbols for the exact people who had mocked and hated her while she was alive. "You look pale," Vivian Madison sneered, noticing my silence. "Do not tell me you are jealous. Mom said you would probably throw a fit once you realized we were upgrading our lifestyle. She said you always had a poverty mindset." "She did not upgrade your lifestyle," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "She committed a felony. That jewelry belongs to me. She robbed the safe while Dad was in the ICU." Madison scoffed, completely unbothered by the accusation. "Oh, please. Dad already approved the sale. Mom told me everything. You are just bitter because Grandma's junk is finally being put to good use. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a reservation at the country club. I need to show off my new ride to people who actually matter." She slid back into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and revved the engine. The loud exhaust echoed across the property as she shifted into gear and sped away, leaving a trail of dust settling over my faded sedan. I stood alone in the driveway for a long time. The Texas heat baked my shoulders, but my blood ran ice cold. Brenda was moving faster than I ever anticipated. She was spending the money to create a facade of wealth, knowing that once the auction in Dallas concluded, she would be a millionaire. She was banking on my father's weak spine to shield her from any legal consequences. She thought I would just stand in the driveway crying over my beat-up car, defeated by her shiny new purchases. The despair I felt moments ago hardened into a sharp, focused resolve. I refused to break. I refused to let a woman who married into my family for a free ride dismantle the empire my grandmother built with her bare hands. I turned my back on the empty driveway and walked briskly toward my guest house. I unlocked the front door and headed straight for my small home office. I pulled out my laptop and opened a blank browser window. I needed to act immediately. I needed to find the direct contact information for Sterling and Hayes Luxury Auctions in Dallas. I needed to draft a formal legal notice to halt the sale, flagging the items as stolen property. I was going to call every director, every appraiser, and every legal consultant listed on their corporate website until someone listened to me. But as I sat down at my desk and connected my laptop to the wireless network, I glanced out the window. Across the manicured lawn, standing on the second-floor balcony of the main house, was Brenda. She was watching me. She held a cell phone to her ear, her eyes fixed directly on my guest house window. Even from a distance, I could see the cold calculation in her posture. Brenda was not stupid. She saw the confrontation in the driveway. She knew I was not packing my bags in defeat. She knew I was preparing to fight back, which meant I was a direct threat to the remaining $750,000 sitting on the auction block in Dallas. If I was going to contact the auction house and ruin her payday, Brenda knew she had to eliminate my credibility and my stability. She had to remove me from the board entirely. I pulled down the window blinds, plunging my office into shadows, unaware that Brenda had already set her next trap in motion. I spent the next 4 hours sitting at my small desk, dialing every phone number listed on the Sterling and Hayes corporate directory. My strategy was straightforward. I needed to reach the legal compliance department and flag the Victoria Morgan estate collection as stolen property before the catalog went to print for the general public. The Dallas auction house was a fortress of bureaucracy. The first 3 receptionists I spoke to refused to transfer me to a director. They repeated the same corporate script, stating they could not discuss private consignments with anyone other than the contracted client. I remained polite but firm, demanding to leave voicemails for their head appraiser. I quoted Texas property laws. I provided my grandmother's full legal name and date of death. I explicitly stated that Brenda did not have the title to those diamonds. By the fifth phone call, my voice grew hoarse. A junior compliance officer finally answered, sounding rushed and annoyed. He listened to my claim for less than 30 seconds before cutting me off. He coldly informed me that their legal team had already vetted the seller. According to their records, the current owner possessed a signed affidavit of transfer from the original estate. If I wanted to dispute the sale, he said I would need to provide a formal court injunction. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone screen, feeling the walls close in around me. Brenda had forged an affidavit. She had manufactured a paper trail strong enough to satisfy a luxury auction house, and she used my father's hospitalization as the perfect cover to execute the deal without interference. My father was the executor of Victoria's primary estate, meaning his signature was the only thing Brenda needed to fake. I needed a lawyer, but hiring a competent estate attorney in Austin required a retainer I simply did not have. I was a veterinary clinic manager, living paycheck to paycheck, paying market rent, to live on my own family's property. The following morning, I woke up before dawn. I brewed a pot of cheap coffee, trying to formulate a plan to secure a loan for legal representation. Just as I poured my first cup, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed from my front door. I set my mug on the counter and opened the door. Brenda stood on my front porch. She wore a tailored navy blazer and immaculate white slacks, looking like she was heading to a country club brunch rather than delivering a threat. In her right hand, she held a thick manila folder. Her posture was rigid, radiating a calculated, quiet menace. "Good morning, Vivian," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. I did not invite her inside. I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "What do you want, Brenda?" She sighed, acting as though my hostility was just a tragic burden she had to bear. She extended her arm, pushing the manila folder against my chest. I took it instinctively. "I received a very interesting phone call from Dallas this morning." Brenda began inspecting her manicured fingernails. "The legal department at Sterling and Hayes informed me that an agitated woman was harassing their staff, making wild, defamatory claims about my private auction lot. They found it quite amusing, really, but I found it deeply concerning." I opened the folder. Resting on top was a single sheet of heavy legal paper. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Formal notice to vacate." My eyes scanned the document. It was a legally binding 30-day eviction notice drafted by a local real estate attorney ordering me to surrender the keys to the guest house and vacate the premises. My stomach tied itself into a cold, tight knot. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is exactly what it looks like," Brenda replied smoothly. "You have 30 days to pack your things and leave the ranch. Madison is tired of living in the main house and she wants her own space. Your father and I decided it was time to transition this property over to her. The deed transfer is already in progress." "You are lying," I fired back, stepping onto the porch. "Dad would never evict me. I pay rent every single month. I replace the roof on this cabin with my own money. I mend the fences. I take care of the livestock when the ranch hands call in sick. This is my home." Brenda smiled. It was not a happy expression. It was the victorious smirk of a predator closing its jaws. "Your father is a very tired, very sick man, Vivian. He had a stroke. The last thing he needs is a bitter, ungrateful daughter causing a scene and accusing his wife of federal crimes. I spoke to him about your little crusade last night. I told him you were threatening to drag our family name through a messy public legal battle over some old jewelry. Do you want to know what he said?" I stared at her, refusing to give her the satisfaction of asking. "He told me to handle it," Brenda whispered, leaning closer. "He gave me full permission to remove the source of his stress. So here is how this plays out. You are going to stop calling Dallas. You are going to stop spreading malicious lies about my inheritance. If you do not stop, I will not just evict you. I will make sure your father never speaks to you again. I control his visitors at the hospital. I control his medical proxies. If you keep pushing, you will be homeless, and you will lose your father permanently." She did not wait for a response. She turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking sharply against the wooden steps, and walked back across the manicured lawn toward the main house. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the manila folder on the hardwood floor. The eviction notice spilled out, mocking me with its crisp black ink. The injustice of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I walked through the small living room, looking at the life I had built here. I had spent countless weekends sanding these floors, painting the walls, and turning a neglected storage cabin into a warm, inviting home. I paid market-rate rent to my father every month without fail. I stayed on the ranch to be close to him, to help maintain the land my grandmother loved so dearly. And now I was being thrown out into the street so a spoiled 24-year-old could have a private party house funded by stolen diamonds. My chest physically ached. The realization that my father had chosen his comfort over my survival was a jagged pill to swallow. He threw me to the wolves because Brenda asked him to. I walked into the bedroom and pulled a flattened cardboard box from the top shelf of my closet. I taped the bottom shut, my movements slow and mechanical. I walked over to my bookshelf and started pulling down framed photographs. A picture of me and my grandmother riding horses, a photo of my high school graduation, small, irreplaceable tokens of a family that no longer existed. I placed the photos into the cardboard box. Each item felt like a heavy stone. I was packing up my history, preparing to retreat, preparing to lose. The sheer cruelty of my blood relatives broke something inside me. I was a hard worker. I was honest. I followed the rules my entire life, and it earned me nothing but an eviction notice and a stolen inheritance. I picked up the cardboard box and carried it out to the front porch. The midday Texas heat was already pressing down thick and humid. I set the box on the wooden planks, sat down beside it, and pulled my knees to my chest. I stared out at the rolling green acres of the Morgan Ranch, and for the first time since my father collapsed, I started to cry. I did not sob loudly. The tears just fell silent and hot, born from a deep welling frustration. I cried for my grandmother Victoria, who worked so hard to build an empire, only to have it dismantled by a greedy opportunist. I cried for my father, who was too weak to defend his own child. Most of all, I cried for myself, realizing I was entirely orphaned despite my father still drawing breath a few miles away in a hospital bed. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, taking a deep, ragged breath. I sat on the porch for nearly an hour, letting the despair run its course. When the tears finally stopped, a quiet, hollow calm took their place. I stood up and picked up the cardboard box. I carried it back inside the guest house, determined to pack the rest of my sentimental belongings before Brenda found another way to hurt me. I carried the box toward the corner of my bedroom, where a piece of antique furniture stood quietly against the wall. It was a dark mahogany writing desk. Brenda had tried to throw it in the local landfill 3 years ago, calling it an ugly piece of trash. I had dragged it out of the dumpster myself and restored it. It belonged to Victoria. I set the cardboard box down and reached out to open the top drawer of the desk, intending to empty out the old stationery inside. I had used this desk 100 times before, but today, as I pulled the brass handle, my hand brushed against something strange, tucked deep underneath the wooden frame. It felt like a small, hidden metal latch. I knelt down, my heart suddenly skipping a beat, and pressed my finger against the cold metal mechanism. I knelt on the hardwood floor, my fingers tracing the underside of the dark mahogany desk. The wood was smooth, polished by decades of use, but right near the back left leg, the grain gave way to cold metal. It was a small rectangular latch flush against the frame, practically invisible unless you knew exactly where to search. My heart picked up a strange, uneven rhythm. I pressed my thumb against the metal plate and pushed upward. A sharp click echoed in the quiet bedroom. A hidden panel seamlessly dropped down from the bottom of the drawer, revealing a shallow velvet-lined compartment. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. Resting in the center of the dark red velvet was a heavy brass key. It was longer than a standard house key, etched with deep grooves and a stamped serial number. Next to the key lay a small square of thick ivory paper folded neatly in half. My hands trembled as I reached into the compartment. I picked up the paper first. The edges were slightly yellowed, carrying the faint familiar scent of lavender and old books that always followed my grandmother. I opened the note. The handwriting was unmistakable. It featured the sharp, elegant cursive Victoria used whenever she drafted important business contracts. The ink was faded, but the message was crystal clear. It read, "For Vivian when the vultures begin to circle." I stared at those 8 words until the letters blurred. When the vultures begin to circle, she knew, she always knew. A vivid memory surfaced, pulling me back to a humid July afternoon 12 years ago. I was 18, sweeping the front porch, while Victoria sat in her rocking chair drinking iced tea. Brenda had been married to my father for less than a year. That afternoon, Brenda marched onto the porch, waving a landscaping catalog demanding that Victoria cut down the ancient pecan trees lining the driveway because they dropped too many leaves on her new luxury sedan. Victoria did not raise her voice. She did not even set down her glass. She just looked at Brenda with eyes as cold and hard as river stones. She told Brenda that those trees had roots deeper than any marriage certificate. She said, "You can sweep the leaves or you can park in the street. But as long as I am drawing breath, you will not touch a single branch on this property." Brenda had retreated, her face flushed with quiet fury. Later that evening, Victoria called me into her study. She held my hands, her calloused fingers rough against my skin. She told me that some people build their own houses while others wait for a storm so they can steal the lumber. She pointed to the window, gesturing toward the main house where Brenda was complaining to my father. Victoria called her a vulture, a scavenger, waiting for a moment of weakness to pick the bones clean. At the time, I thought Victoria was just being a protective, stubborn matriarch. I did not realize she was issuing a prophecy. My grandmother saw the greed rotting inside my stepmother from day one. She knew that the moment my father showed a sign of weakness, Brenda would swoop in to consume everything of value. I looked down at the heavy brass key in my palm. The stamped logo on the rounded head read, "Texas Heritage Trust and Savings." It was a legacy bank located in the heart of downtown Austin, an institution that catered to old money and long-standing family estates. The despair that had anchored me to the floor moments ago evaporated. The suffocating weight of the eviction notice and the stolen jewelry lifted, replaced by a sharp electric surge of hope. My grandmother did not leave my future up to chance. She did not trust my father to protect me, and she certainly did not leave $1 million heritage vulnerable to a woman she accurately diagnosed as a scavenger. Victoria had built a trap, and she left the trigger in my hands. I stood up, gripping the key so tightly, the grooved edges dug into my skin. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my cell phone, and dialed the front desk of the veterinary clinic. My manager, Sarah, answered on the second ring. "Sarah, I need to take the rest of the day off," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It is a family emergency." Sarah knew about my father being in the hospital. She expressed her sympathy, told me to take all the time I needed, and promised to cover my shifts. I hung up the phone and threw my work uniform into the laundry basket. I washed my face, brushed my hair, and changed into a clean, professional navy blouse and dark trousers. I needed to look like a woman who belonged inside a high-end financial institution, not a defeated ranch hand packing up her life in cardboard boxes. I grabbed my purse, dropped the brass key into the zippered pocket, and walked out of the guest house. I did not look at the main house. I did not look at the empty space in the driveway where Madison had parked her stolen Porsche. I climbed into my faded Honda Civic, started the engine, and drove through the iron gates of the Morgan Ranch. The drive into downtown Austin took 45 minutes, but it felt like 5. The highway stretched out ahead of me, flanked by sun-baked fields and sprawling construction sites. My mind raced with possibilities. What did she leave in that vault? Was it a separate cash account? Was it property deeds? The auction in Dallas was looming, ticking closer every single hour. Brenda was already spending the advance, arrogant and secure in her belief that she had outsmarted us all. I merged onto the interstate, gripping the steering wheel. The Austin skyline emerged in the distance, tall glass buildings reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. I navigated the congested city streets until I reached Congress Avenue. The Texas Heritage Trust and Savings Building stood on a busy corner, looking like a fortress of limestone and polished marble. It projected permanence and security. I found a parking garage a block away, pulled my car into a narrow spot, and walked toward the bank. The hot city pavement radiated heat through the soles of my shoes. Every step felt deliberate. I was no longer a victim reacting to a crisis. I was an active participant in my own rescue. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the bank, stepping into the cool air-conditioned lobby. The interior was vast and hushed, echoing with the quiet rustle of expensive suits and murmured conversations. A security guard nodded to me as I approached the main reception desk. Behind the polished mahogany counter stood a teller in a crisp gray suit. "Good afternoon, how can I assist you today?" she asked, offering a professional smile. I reached into my purse and pulled out the heavy brass key. I placed it gently on the counter. The metal clinked softly against the wood. "I need to access a safety deposit box," I said. "It belongs to the estate of Victoria Morgan." The teller glanced at the key, her professional smile faltering for just a fraction of a second as she recognized the specific grooved pattern and the vintage serial number. She typed a few quick keystrokes into her terminal. "Of course, Miss Morgan," she said, her tone suddenly shifting to a much more deferential pitch. "The vault manager will need to escort you down. Please have a seat in the waiting area." I sat down on a plush leather sofa near the back of the lobby. My leg bounced nervously. I checked my phone. It was quiet. Brenda had not texted. My father had not called. They both assumed I was back at the ranch crying over an eviction notice, preparing to surrender. They were wrong. But as I sat there waiting for the vault manager, I did not realize that Brenda had noticed my car leaving the property. I did not know that her paranoia was already festering, driving her to make a vicious, desperate phone call that would attempt to destroy my professional reputation before I even had the chance to open that deposit box. My cell phone vibrated against the leather cushion of the bank sofa. I pulled it from my purse, expecting to see a hospital update or perhaps a frantic text message from Madison. Instead, the caller ID displayed the main office line for the veterinary clinic. I frowned, staring at the screen. I had just spoken to Dr. Sarah Evans less than an hour ago. Sarah was the owner and head veterinarian of the practice, a brilliant woman who had mentored me for the past 5 years. I managed her entire front house operation. She had already cleared my schedule for the week. I swiped the screen to answer, keeping my voice hushed to avoid disturbing the quiet, reverent atmosphere of the bank lobby. "Hello, Sarah," I whispered. "Did I forget to log out of the surgical inventory system before I left?" "Vivian, are you driving right now?" Sarah asked. Her tone was unnervingly serious, entirely stripped of her usual warm bedside manner. "Are you parked somewhere safe?" I shifted on the leather sofa, a sudden spike of anxiety tightening my chest. "I am sitting in the lobby of a bank downtown." "What is wrong? Did something happen with one of the boarding animals?" "Nothing is wrong here at the clinic," Sarah replied, her voice dropping to a low, careful register. "But I just received a very disturbing phone call on the private administrative line." It was your stepmother. The air in my lungs turned to ice. "Brenda. Why would Brenda call the clinic?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Vivian, she put on quite a performance. She was crying hysterically. She introduced herself as your concerned mother. She told me she was calling out of a desperate sense of moral obligation to protect my business. She claimed that the stress of your father suffering a stroke had triggered a severe mental breakdown." I closed my eyes, pressing the cold glass of the phone against my cheek. I could perfectly picture Brenda sitting in the air-conditioned comfort of the main house, squeezing out crocodile tears, playing the role of the tragic, burdened matriarch trying to manage a rogue stepdaughter. "It gets worse," Sarah continued, her tone laced with deep disgust. "She told me you have a secret, escalating gambling addiction. She claimed you are drowning in underground debt, and that you recently attempted to steal valuable family assets from your own father while he was lying helpless in the intensive care unit. She said she caught you in the act and that you are now wandering the city in a delusional state. She strongly advised me to terminate your employment immediately, change the security codes on the clinic doors, and audit our financial accounts before you drain them to pay off your bookies." The sheer, unadulterated venom of the lie left me speechless. A gambling addiction, a psychotic break. Brenda was not just trying to evict me from the ranch, she was trying to incinerate my entire professional reputation. She wanted to sever my only source of independent income, ensuring I would be homeless, destitute, and unemployable. But the strategy went much deeper than simple spite. As I sat there in the bank lobby, the cold logic of her smear campaign clicked into place. Brenda had watched my beat-up sedan leave the property. She realized I was not staying in the guest house to pack my bags in quiet defeat. Her paranoia had flared. She knew I was fighting back, which meant I was a direct threat to the Dallas auction. If I managed to contact the right legal authorities, or if I somehow reached the directors at Sterling and Hayes, I would accuse her of theft. Brenda needed to poison the well before I even took a sip. If I went to the police or if I showed up at the auction house claiming she stole $1 million jewelry collection, Brenda would simply point to my ruined credibility. She would shake her head sadly and tell the authorities that I was a disgruntled fired employee suffering from a mental health crisis, desperately trying to steal her legitimate inheritance to feed a gambling habit. Who would the Dallas elite believe? The glamorous, wealthy widow holding a forged affidavit, or the unemployed, estranged stepdaughter with a fabricated record of instability? She was building a defense by bankrupting my character. Sarah, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and raw adrenaline. I swear to you, none of that is true. She robbed my father's safe. She stole my grandmother's jewelry collection, and she is trying to auction it off in Dallas. She just served me with an eviction notice this morning because I caught her. Vivian, stop, Sarah interrupted firmly. You do not need to defend yourself to me. I let that woman spin her theatrical web of lies for 10 solid minutes. I listened to every fake sob. And do you know what I did when she finished her performance? What did you do? I told her she was speaking to the wrong person, Sarah said, a fierce protective edge sharpening her words. I told her I have trusted you to manage my surgical inventory and my business accounts for 5 years. I have watched you sleep on a concrete floor to monitor a sick golden retriever. I know you balance petty cash down to the final penny. I told your stepmother that if she ever called my practice again to defame my clinic manager, I would have my own corporate lawyer draft a harassment lawsuit before she could hang up the receiver. Then I ended the call and blocked her number. A hot tear slipped down my cheek. In a week where my own flesh and blood had betrayed me, abandoned me, and tried to destroy me, my boss was standing like a brick wall between me and my abuser. The relief was staggering. Thank you, I whispered, wiping my face with the back of my hand. Sarah, you have no idea what that means to me right now. She is terrified. She is acting erratically to protect a cash advance she took from the auction house. She spent the money on a sports car for Madison. She is trying to eliminate me before the sale goes public. Then you need to move faster than she is, Sarah advised, her tone shifting from supportive friend back to decisive business owner. People like your stepmother rely on their victims being too shocked to fight back. She threw a punch, hoping it would knock you out. You need to show her you are still standing. Do whatever you have to do today. Your job is safe. We ended the call. I lowered the phone to my lap, staring at the polished marble floor of the bank lobby. Sarah was right. Brenda was playing dirty because she was running on a tight schedule. I mentally reviewed the glossy black catalog I had found on the kitchen island, the Sterling and Hayes fall preview event. The timeline suddenly crystallized in my mind, sending a fresh wave of urgency coursing through my veins. The private preview gala for elite buyers was scheduled for this upcoming weekend in Dallas. The actual bidding would commence the following morning. Today was Tuesday. I had less than 72 hours to build a barricade sturdy enough to stop a high-speed freight train of counterfeit luxury. If I did not secure proof of my inheritance by Friday night, Brenda would stand in a glittering ballroom, sipping expensive champagne, shaking hands with billionaires as they placed bids on my grandmother's legacy. Once those diamonds were sold to private collectors, and the funds were legally transferred, recovering the heirlooms would become a logistical nightmare stretching across years of costly litigation. Brenda would walk away a millionaire, my father would remain her manipulated hostage, and I would be swept away into the margins of their new wealthy lives. The ticking clock echoed in my ears louder than the hushed conversations of the bank patrons around me. I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers tightly around the heavy brass key. Brenda was trying to bury me under a mountain of lies, but she forgot one crucial detail. "You cannot bury someone who holds the key to the vault, Miss Morgan." I looked up. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a charcoal suit was standing at the edge of the waiting area. He wore a silver name tag that identified him as the senior vault manager. He offered a polite, practiced smile, gesturing toward a set of heavy steel double doors at the back of the lobby. "We are ready for you now," he said softly. "If you will follow me, I can escort you down to the secure archives." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy trousers. I slipped my phone back into my purse, leaving Brenda's smear campaign behind in the lobby. I followed the manager across the marble floor, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. The plot was no longer about defending my character. It was about uncovering the weapon my grandmother had forged for me from beyond the grave. I stepped through the heavy steel doors, ready to descend into the vault and discover exactly what Victoria had left in the dark. The elevator doors closed, sealing away the hum of the main lobby. I stood next to the senior vault manager as we descended below the bustling Austin streets. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the faint, crisp scent of polished metal and filtered ozone. I watched the digital floor indicator tick downward. My reflection in the brushed steel doors looked different than it had an hour ago. The exhausted, defeated woman who sat on the guest house porch was gone. In her place stood someone focused, steady, and armed with a singular purpose. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal a subterranean fortress. The walls of the Texas Heritage Trust and Savings Vault were lined with thousands of identical gleaming safety deposit boxes. A secondary security guard verified my identification and logged my entry into a thick leather-bound ledger. The vault manager motioned for me to follow him down a long, brightly lit corridor. The silence down here was profound. It felt disconnected from the chaos unfolding back at the ranch, far away from Brenda and her frantic, desperate lies. We stopped in front of a vertical column of boxes near the back wall. The manager gestured toward a wide rectangular door labeled 812. I retrieved the heavy brass key from my purse and handed it to him. He inserted his master key into the left lock, then slid my brass key into the right. He turned them simultaneously. A heavy, satisfying click echoed through the quiet corridor. The manager pulled the long metal drawer free from the wall, resting it on a wheeled steel cart. He did not look inside. Bank protocol required strict privacy for clients. "Right this way, Miss Morgan," he said, guiding the cart into a private windowless viewing room located just off the main corridor. The room contained a single mahogany table, a leather chair, and a soft reading lamp. He parked the cart next to the table. "Take all the time you need. Press the call button by the door when you are finished." He stepped out and closed the heavy door behind him. The lock engaged with a soft thud. I was entirely alone. I stood in front of the metal drawer, my pulse drumming a frantic beat against my ribs. I reached out and lifted the hinged lid. I expected to find stacks of cash or perhaps loose property deeds. Instead, the container held two distinct items. Resting on the right side was a thick leather-bound legal folio. Taking up the left half of the drawer was a beautiful, intricately carved wooden box made of dark walnut. I carefully lifted the wooden box out of the metal drawer and placed it onto the mahogany table. The craftsmanship was exquisite, featuring delicate floral patterns carved into the dark wood. But what caught my attention was the center of the lid. Pressed firmly into the wood was a thick, deep red wax seal. It was perfectly preserved, bearing the Morgan family crest, a solitary star surrounded by twisting oak leaves. I gently set the box aside and reached for the leather-bound folio. I opened the heavy cover. The first page was a crisp sheet of legal paper stamped with multiple official notary seals dated 5 years ago. The bold black text across the top header sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. It read, "The Victoria Morgan Irrevocable Heritage Trust." I sat down in the leather chair, pulling the document closer under the reading lamp. My eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs, deciphering the formal language my grandmother had carefully constructed. Victoria did not merely draft a standard will. She knew a standard will could be contested, delayed, or manipulated by a greedy spouse whispering poison into my father's ear. Instead, Victoria locked the title of her entire $1.1 million jewelry collection into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I turned the page and found a detailed, itemized inventory. Every single diamond necklace, every sapphire ring, and the platinum chandelier earrings Brenda had paraded around the house were listed with their exact appraisal values and serial numbers. The next clause detailed the terms of succession. Upon the legal death of Victoria Morgan, the document stated that Vivian Morgan was immediately named as the sole undisputed trustee and beneficiary of the trust. But Victoria went one step further. She built a failsafe to ensure Brenda could never fence the items behind my back. I read the final addendum 3 times to ensure I was understanding the legal reality. The trust explicitly dictated that no item within the Victoria Morgan collection could be legally transferred, sold, auctioned, or consigned without 2 distinct elements. The first element was the notarized signature of the active trustee, which was me. The second element was the physical presentation of the original wax family seal, currently attached to the carved wooden box, sitting right in front of me on the table. Victoria had registered that specific wax seal with the International Jewelers Guild as the sole authentication mark for her estate. Without the wax seal and my signature, the jewelry was legally unsellable. The pieces Brenda stole from the wall safe were now legally classified as stolen trust assets. Brenda only took physical possession of the diamonds. She did not possess the legal title. When she drove up to Dallas and signed a consignment contract with Sterling and Hayes Luxury Auctions, she presented a forged affidavit. When she accepted a $250,000 cash advance across state lines, using stolen trust property as collateral, she crossed a very dark, very serious line. She walked right into federal wire fraud and title theft. Brenda thought she was executing a clean, untraceable robbery. In reality, she had wrapped a federal indictment around her own neck, and she was currently driving a luxury sports car purchased with stolen funds. A profound sense of awe washed over me. I looked at the dark walnut box tracing the edge of the red wax seal with my fingertip. My grandmother had orchestrated a masterful, flawless trap from the grave. She anticipated Brenda's greed, she anticipated my father's cowardice, and she armed me with a legal weapon so formidable it would shatter Brenda's high society facade into a million unrecoverable pieces. I returned my attention to the metal drawer to ensure I had not missed any other documents. Lying flat against the very bottom of the container was a single ivory envelope. My name was written across the front in Victoria's elegant cursive. I picked up the envelope and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. I unfolded the thick paper, my vision already blurring with unshed tears. My dearest Vivian. The letter began. If you are reading these words, it means the worst has happened. It means my son David failed you and Brenda finally showed her true colors. I gripped the paper, the accuracy of her words striking me like a physical blow. I have watched you grow into a brilliant, hard-working woman, Victoria wrote. You inherited my grit, Vivian. You spent your life honoring our family, working the ranch, and asking for nothing in return. But I also watched how Brenda treated you. I saw the quiet cruelty, the subtle dismissals, and the way she slowly poisoned David against his own blood. I apologize for my son. I raised a boy who grew into a man too weak to stand up to a predator. I realized years ago that I could not change your father's spine, so I decided to build you a shield instead. A hot tear escaped my eye and dropped onto the mahogany table. I placed the jewelry in this trust to guarantee your independence. The letter continued. Brenda is a scavenger who measures her worth by what she can steal from others. She will try to take your history. Do not let her. Use this trust to defend yourself. Do not shrink to make them comfortable. Take back what is yours. Build your own life and never apologize for surviving. I love you, Vivian. Always. I pressed the letter against my chest, letting out a shaky, grounding breath. For years, Brenda had tried to make me feel small. She called me a nuisance, a bitter stepdaughter, a roadblock to her glamorous lifestyle. She nearly convinced me that I was alone in the world. But sitting in that quiet subterranean bank vault holding the physical proof of my grandmother's fierce, protective love, the final remnants of my self-doubt burned away. I was not crazy. I was not a victim. I was the sole guardian of the Morgan family legacy. I carefully folded the letter and tucked it into my purse. I gathered the heavy leather folio and the carved wooden box securing them under my arm. The emotional validation settled deep into my bones, but the tactical reality of the situation immediately demanded my attention. I held the proof, but a piece of paper alone would not stop a multi-million-dollar corporate auction machine. Sterling and Hayes was a prestigious Dallas institution with a ruthless legal team. I could not just walk into their preview gala and wave a folder around. If I wanted to execute Victoria's trap and stop the bidding, I needed heavy legal firepower. I needed an attorney who understood high-stakes estate law, someone who could draft an undeniable injunction and serve it directly to the auction directors before the hammer dropped. The preview gala was rapidly approaching. The clock was ticking. I picked up my phone and searched for the top estate litigation firms in Austin, knowing I had to find a lawyer sharp enough to dismantle Brenda's counterfeit empire before the weekend arrived. I pressed the call button located by the heavy metal door. The vault manager returned within seconds, his polished shoes silent against the tile floor. Before he could wheel the metal drawer away, I asked him a crucial question. I needed an attorney who specialized in high-stakes estate litigation. I needed someone ruthless. The manager nodded, reached into his tailored suit jacket, and handed me a thick, matte black business card. He told me the bank retained several external legal consultants for complex trust disputes, but there was only one man he recommended for a hostile asset recovery: Julian Pierce. His office was located 3 blocks away in a sleek, glass-fronted high-rise overlooking the Colorado River. I marched out of the bank clutching my grandmother's carved wooden box and the heavy leather folio against my chest. The Austin heat baked the pavement, radiating through the soles of my shoes, but I barely felt the temperature. I navigated the crowded sidewalks, my mind racing through the logistics of the impending battle. I entered the law firm lobby and bypassed the standard waiting room, handing the receptionist the vault manager's card. She made a brief phone call. 10 minutes later, I was escorted down a long hallway lined with abstract art and frosted glass doors. I stepped into a corner office and found myself sitting across a sprawling mahogany desk from a man who radiated cold, calculated authority. Julian Pierce was in his late 40s, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, his piercing, dark eyes scanning my face with analytical precision. I did not waste time with small talk or polite introductions. I placed the leather trust folio and the carved walnut box directly onto the center of his desk. I explained my father's recent stroke, Brenda's sudden raid on the wall, safe the forged estate affidavit, and the upcoming private auction in Dallas. Julian did not interrupt. He listened in utter silence, his expression unreadable, his hands steepled under his chin. When I finished speaking, he reached for the leather folio. The sprawling office fell quiet save for the rhythmic turning of thick parchment pages. I watched his eyes track across Victoria's dense legal clauses. He spent nearly 20 minutes dissecting the document, checking the official notary stamps, reading the intricate succession stipulations, and verifying the exact verbiage regarding the authentication seal. The silence stretched, pulling the tension tight across the room. Finally, he closed the folio, leaned back in his executive chair, and folded his hands together. "Your grandmother was an extraordinarily ruthless architect," Julian stated, a rare note of genuine professional respect coloring his deep voice. "She built an impenetrable fortress. Most individuals draft a standard will and hope their surviving spouse will honor their final wishes out of basic decency. Victoria assumed the worst of human nature and planned accordingly. This document is bulletproof, Vivian. You are the sole uncontested owner of that jewelry collection." I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. "Does that mean we can stop the auction in Dallas?" I asked, leaning forward in my seat. Julian rested his elbows on the desk, his demeanor shifting into something much sharper and far more dangerous. "Stopping the auction is the easiest part of this equation," he explained. We need to discuss the severe gravity of what your stepmother has actually done. When she drove up to Sterling and Hayes presented a fabricated estate affidavit and signed a binding consignment contract, she crossed a boundary into felony territory. But the exact moment she accepted a $250,000 cash advance against stolen trust assets, she escalated her crimes to a federal level. Julian picked up a silver fountain pen, gesturing toward the stack of paperwork. She initiated an interstate financial transaction using counterfeit ownership claims. That constitutes substantial wire fraud. She defrauded a major financial institution. High-end auction houses operate strictly on pedigree, clear titles, and reputation. When Sterling and Hayes discover they wired $250,000 to a thief, they will not merely cancel the sale. Their corporate lawyers will tear her life apart to recover those funds, and the federal authorities will indict her for grand larceny. She has essentially trapped herself in a legal vice. He shifted his gaze to the carved walnut box resting on his desk. He reached out and lightly traced the deep red wax seal. "And this," Julian murmured, "is your definitive kill switch." He explained that in the world of high-end antiquities and elite estate auctions, a registered authentication seal is the ultimate reigning authority. The International Jewelers Guild holds strict permanent records of these familial marks. Without this physical seal and your explicit notarized signature, those diamonds cannot be legally traded, insured, or sold on the open market. The precise moment this wooden box is placed in front of the head appraiser in Dallas, the bidding halts. The auction house is legally obligated by international trade laws to seize the entire lot pending a title dispute, or they risk losing their lucrative operating license. Julian opened a desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He uncapped his pen and looked me directly in the eye, his expression turning entirely serious. "I can end this right now, Vivian." He offered, his voice devoid of any hesitation. "I know the lead investigator at the regional FBI field office in Austin. Given the dollar amount of the stolen advance and the clear paper trail sitting on my desk, I can make one phone call. Federal agents will pull up to your ranch within 3 hours. They will arrest Brenda for wire fraud and title theft before the sun goes down." He laid out the tactical strike with clinical precision. "She will spend tonight in a holding cell wearing a county uniform," Julian continued. "I will personally serve the auction house with a formal injunction by tomorrow morning. Your father will be notified of her arrest, the car she bought will be seized as evidence, and the jewelry will be returned to the vault. It is a clean, definitive end to this nightmare. What do you want me to do?" I sat frozen in the leather chair, processing the sheer, devastating power Julian had just handed me. I pictured Brenda sitting comfortably in the main house, drinking expensive wine, gloating over the eviction notice she had shoved into my chest just hours ago. I imagined her smug, tailored perfection dissolving into sheer panic as federal agents placed her in handcuffs on the front lawn. I pictured Madison screaming as the tow truck hauled her new chalk gray sports car away. It was an incredibly tempting image. It would be swift, highly effective, and entirely deserved. But as I looked down at the red wax seal bearing my family crest, a different vision materialized. Arresting Brenda at the quiet, secluded ranch would be too private. It would give her the opportunity to spin the narrative, to play the tragic victim, to tell her wealthy country club friends that a terrible administrative misunderstanding had occurred and her cruel stepdaughter had overreacted. She had spent a decade building a pristine facade of unearned superiority. She spent the stolen advance on a luxury vehicle to elevate her social status. She called my boss and tried to destroy my career by labeling me a delusional addict. A quiet arrest in the Texas Hill Country was simply not enough to balance those scales. She needed to lose the very thing she valued above all else, her public image. "No," I said softly. The single word hung in the quiet office, heavy with intent. Julian paused, his silver pen hovering above the legal pad. He raised a questioning eyebrow, waiting for me to elaborate. "I do not want her arrested at the ranch today," I explained, finding a cold, hard clarity in my voice. "Brenda thrives on an audience. She steals to impress people. She is planning to stand in front of Dallas high society this weekend, wearing designer clothes paid for with my grandmother's legacy, acting like she is a wealthy heiress. If we arrest her right now, she gets to hide her shame in the shadows. I want her to fall in the light. Julian set his pen down. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face, altering his stern features. He understood exactly what I was proposing. "You want to execute this on the auction floor?" he noted, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Yes," I confirmed, gripping the leather arms of my chair. "I want her to walk into that preview gala, believing she has won. I want her to drink the champagne and accept the premature congratulations from the elite buyers. I want her to feel untouchable. And right before the auctioneer drops the hammer on those diamonds, I am going to walk up to the podium and hand that wooden box to the head appraiser. I want every single billionaire socialite and corporate director in that room to watch her get exposed as a fraud. I want her reputation burned to ash in front of the exact people she is trying to impress." Julian closed the legal pad and pushed it aside. He reached across the wide mahogany desk and shook my hand, his grip firm and resolute. "The trap is officially set, Vivian," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "We are going to Dallas." 3 days later, the humid Austin air gave way to the polished steel and glass skyline of Dallas. The Sterling and Hayes Fall Preview event was being hosted inside the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. Julian Pierce had spent the last 72 hours working in the shadows, orchestrating a masterful legal blockade. He drafted the injunction, contacted his federal liaisons, and secured my access to the highly restricted gala. I walked through the gilded revolving doors, leaving the oppressive Texas heat behind, and stepped into a world of curated opulence. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the evening. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays laden with fluted glasses of imported champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played a soft classical arrangement in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the murmured conversations of the elite. This was the pinnacle of high society, a closed ecosystem of billionaires, wealthy collectors, and corporate titans. It was the exact world Brenda had always desperately craved. Growing up in a series of cramped apartments, my stepmother had spent her youth flipping through glossy fashion magazines, cultivating a deep, bitter envy of the aristocracy. When she married my father, she viewed our working ranch not as a home, but as a stepping stone. Tonight was her ultimate coronation. I stood near the entrance, scanning the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. It did not take long to locate her. Brenda was holding court near the center of the room, standing beside a reinforced glass display case that housed my grandmother's platinum chandelier earrings. She looked like a woman who had finally stepped into the role she believed she deserved. She wore a floor-length emerald green designer gown that hugged her figure, likely purchased using a large chunk of the stolen cash advance. A delicate diamond tennis bracelet sparkled on her wrist. She held a crystal champagne flute, throwing her head back in a practiced musical laugh as she entertained a circle of wealthy prospective buyers. Madison stood close by, dressed in a shimmering silver cocktail dress, nodding along as Brenda spun a fabricated tale about her aristocratic lineage. I watched them play their parts, feeling a strange sense of detachment. A week ago, seeing them flaunt my stolen heritage would have broken my spirit. Tonight, it only fortified my resolve. I was not dripping in expensive new purchases. I wore a simple, elegant navy silk sheath dress, a garment I had owned for years. My dark hair was pinned back in a neat twist, and my only accessory was a small vintage beaded clutch that once belonged to Victoria. The contrast between my modest attire and Brenda's flashy purchased glamour was stark, but I carried a weapon far more potent than emerald silk. I carried the truth. I took a deep breath, adjusted my grip on the vintage clutch, and stepped onto the ballroom floor. I moved purposefully through the crowd, gliding past the string quartet and the ice sculptures. I did not rush. I let my presence register slowly, a quiet storm gathering on the edge of her pristine horizon. Brenda was in the middle of describing the supposed sentimental value of the jewelry to a prominent Dallas oil tycoon when her gaze drifted across the room. I saw the exact second she spotted me. The polite practiced smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, chalky white against the bright emerald fabric of her gown. Her hand trembled, nearly spilling her champagne. Madison noticed her mother's reaction and followed her line of sight. The younger woman gasped, taking an involuntary step backward, bumping into a waiter. I stopped 10 feet away from their circle. I did not glare. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, meeting Brenda's panicked stare with an expression of calm, unbidden certainty. The illusion of her sophisticated grace shattered instantly. The predator who had confidently handed me an eviction notice on my front porch was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified imposter. She knew I did not belong here. She knew this event was strictly invitation, only heavily guarded and reserved for verified clientele. My mere presence in this room signaled a catastrophic breach in her carefully constructed defenses. "Excuse me for a moment," Brenda told the oil tycoon, her voice tight and breathless. She turned on her heel and marched toward the perimeter of the room, frantically signaling 2 broad-shouldered security guards posted near the exit. She pointed a manicured finger in my direction, her movements jerky and desperate. I watched the guards nod, their expressions turning serious as they began to close the distance between us. Brenda walked a few steps behind them, using their imposing size as a shield. When they reached me, she did not wait for them to speak. She launched into a loud, frantic tirade, her voice echoing awkwardly over the soft music. "Remove this woman immediately," Brenda demanded, her tone shrill and frantic. "She is not on the guest list. She is my estranged stepdaughter. She is deeply unwell, and she has a history of severe mental disturbances. She has been stalking my family for days. I demand that you escort her off the premises before she causes a dangerous scene." Several guests turned their heads, drawn by the sudden commotion. The refined atmosphere of the gala hitched, the polite murmurs dying down as elite buyers paused to watch the spectacle unfold. "Ma'am," one of the security guards said, stepping into my personal space with a stern, authoritative posture, "I am going to have to ask you to come with us quietly. This is a private event." Brenda stood behind the guard, clutching her evening bag, a victorious, sneering smirk returning to her lips. She thought she had won. She thought her lies were enough to sweep me out the back door, relegating me to the shadows once again. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my sanity against her wild accusations. I simply opened Victoria's vintage clutch, retrieved a small, heavy piece of cardstock, and handed it directly to the lead security officer. It was a platinum-level all-access pass bearing my full name and the embossed seal of Julian Pierce's law firm, a firm the auction house retained for specialized legal consultations. Julian had registered me as his designated proxy for the evening, granting me unrestricted clearance to the gala. The guard inspected the credential, his stern expression dissolving into confusion. He flipped the card over, verifying the holographic security watermark. He looked at me, then looked back at Brenda. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Miss Morgan," the guard said, taking a respectful step back and handing the pass back to me. "Your credentials are in perfect order. Please enjoy your evening." Brenda's jaw dropped. The victorious smirk vanished, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated horror. She stared at the guard, her eyes wide, struggling to comprehend how her foolproof intimidation tactic had just disintegrated into thin air. "What are you doing?" Brenda hissed, grabbing the guard's sleeve. "She is a fraud. She is a disturbed addict. You cannot let her stay here." The guard gently but firmly detached her hand from his uniform. "Ma'am, this guest has verified VIP clearance. Unless she violates venue policies, she has every right to be on this floor. I suggest you keep your voice down, or we will be forced to ask you to leave for disturbing the other patrons." The security detail tipped their heads to me and walked away, resuming their posts. Brenda and I were left standing alone in the middle of the crowded ballroom. The surrounding guests had watched the entire exchange. They saw Brenda lose her temper, act erratically, and get reprimanded by the staff. The wealthy socialites began to whisper behind their champagne flutes, casting suspicious judging glances at the woman in the emerald gown. Brenda's chest heaved. She looked like a bird trapped inside a glass cage, throwing herself against invisible walls. "You cannot be here," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "How did you get that pass? What do you think you are doing, Vivian?" I offered her a soft, chilling smile. "I am just here to admire the exhibits, Brenda. It is a beautiful collection, is it not?" I held her gaze, refusing to blink. The power dynamics shifted violently, the ground cracking beneath her designer heels. For 10 years, she had dictated the terms of my existence. She stole my inheritance, tried to destroy my career, and attempted to render me homeless. But tonight, standing under the crystal chandeliers, she finally realized that her lies held no currency. She was entirely exposed, a trespasser playing dress-up in my family's legacy. I turned away, leaving her trembling in the center of the room. I walked slowly toward the display cases, knowing she would spend the rest of the evening looking over her shoulder, suffocating under the weight of her own paranoia. The trap was locked. Tomorrow morning, before the bidding commenced, she would discover exactly how deep the jaws were going to bite. I had backed her into a corner, and the time for final warnings was rapidly approaching. The sun rose over the Dallas skyline, piercing the glass facades of the financial district with cold, sharp light. It was Saturday morning, the day of the auction. The grand floor of Sterling and Hayes was already buzzing with an electric, high-stakes energy. Wealthy collectors and proxy bidders took their seats in rows of plush velvet chairs, reviewing their glossy catalogs one final time. I bypassed the main seating area, navigating the carpeted stairs leading up to the private VIP suites overlooking the podium. Julian had provided me with the architectural layout of the building, mapping out exactly where the elite sellers waited while their lots went up for bid. I walked down the hushed, softly lit corridor on the second level, tracing the brass room numbers with my eyes. When I reached Suite 7, I paused. Through the thick, soundproof glass panel embedded in the mahogany door, I saw my family. Brenda stood near a lavish catered breakfast spread, pouring a cup of espresso. She wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, looking sharp, victorious, and confident. But what caught my breath was the man sitting near the window. It was my father. David sat in a leather wheelchair, looking fragile and woefully out of place in the opulent room. The stroke had left a noticeable toll on his body. His skin was pale, and the left side of his face drooped slightly. He wore a dark charcoal suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. Brenda had actually checked him out of the hospital against medical advice. She dragged a recovering stroke victim across state lines just so she could prop him up in a VIP suite. She needed him here. He was the official executor of Victoria's primary estate, the silent, compliant puppet she required to legitimize her counterfeit narrative. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The thick hinges swung silently. I stepped inside the suite, letting the door click shut behind me. Brenda spun around, nearly spilling her espresso. Her initial shock quickly hardened into a mask of bitter annoyance. David gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his eyes widening as he registered my presence. Madison was noticeably absent, likely downstairs, securing a front-row seat to watch her mother become a millionaire. "How did you get up here?" Brenda snapped, setting her porcelain cup on the table with a sharp clatter. "This floor is restricted to clients." I ignored her focus and directed my attention to the frail man sitting by the glass. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You should not be here. You need to be resting in a hospital bed, not sitting in an auction house covering for a thief." My father swallowed hard, refusing to look me in the eye. He stared down at his polished leather shoes, his hands trembling slightly against the dark upholstery of his chair. He looked like a man who knew he was committing a terrible sin, but lacked the moral fortitude to stop it. "I am feeling fine, Vivian," he muttered, his voice weak and raspy. "Your stepmother made sure I was comfortable. We are just here to finalize the estate transition. You need to leave before you cause another scene." The sheer cowardice of his response settled over me like a heavy frost. I turned my attention back to Brenda. She was standing tall, crossing her arms, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance. "I came up here to give you one final chance," I told them, stepping further into the suite. "This is my last olive branch. You are currently standing in the middle of a legal minefield, and you are seconds away from stepping on a tripwire." Brenda rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Are we really doing this again? Did you come all the way up here to threaten me with more of your imaginary lawyers? You made a fool of yourself at the gala last night, Vivian. Do not embarrass yourself further. The lot is going up for bid in less than 30 minutes. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to let her condescension break my rhythm. "I know exactly when the lot goes up," I replied calmly. "And I know exactly what you did to get it there. You forged a transfer affidavit. You used my father's medical incapacitation to raid the wall safe. And you committed federal wire fraud when you accepted a $250,000 cash advance from this auction house, using stolen property as collateral." The color drained slightly from Brenda's face, but she quickly recovered, masking her anxiety with renewed hostility. "You are insane," she hissed, taking a step toward me. "That jewelry belongs to me." David signed the authorization. "It is perfectly legal." "It is not legal," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "The primary estate documents do not govern that jewelry. Victoria placed the entire collection into an irrevocable trust 5 years ago. I am the sole beneficiary, and I am the only authorized trustee. The contract you signed with Sterling and Hayes is fraudulent." I watched my father flinch at the mention of my grandmother's name. I walked over to his wheelchair, kneeling down so I was at his eye level. I needed him to understand the devastating reality of what was about to happen. Dad listened to me carefully. I pleaded, searching his evasive eyes for any shred of the man who raised me. "If you let that auctioneer step up to the podium, Brenda is going to federal prison. The FBI investigates interstate title theft. The moment the auction house realizes they funded a fraudulent consignment, they will freeze your accounts, seize the ranch, and indict your wife. I am giving you a chance to stop this. Call the floor manager right now, withdraw the lot, return the advance money. If you do that quietly, I will take the jewelry back to Austin and I will not press criminal charges. You can walk away." It was a genuine offer of grace. Despite the eviction notice, despite the smear campaign at my clinic, despite the unbearable cruelty of the past week, I was offering them a clean exit. I was giving my father a chance to save his own dignity. The silence in the VIP suite grew thick and suffocating. The muffled sound of the auctioneer testing his microphone drifted through the soundproof glass, a steady thump echoing in the background. My father looked at me. For a brief, fleeting second, I saw a flash of realization in his eyes. He recognized the truth in my words. He knew his mother was sharp enough to build a legal trap. He knew Brenda was more than capable of forging his signature. He knew I was trying to save him from a catastrophic scandal. But then he looked at Brenda. He looked at the tailored crimson suit, the expensive lifestyle she demanded, and the relentless emotional exhaustion she would inflict upon him if he defied her. The fight drained out of him. He chose the path of least resistance, surrendering his integrity for the sake of a quiet ride home. "Vivian, stop this nonsense," my father whispered, turning his head away from me and staring blankly out the window. "You are ruining a very important day for our family. You always resented your stepmother. I will not sit here and listen to you accuse her of these ridiculous crimes. Go back to Austin." The rejection was absolute. He had wholly abdicated his role as a parent. Brenda let out a triumphant sigh, stepping forward to stand beside his wheelchair. She placed a possessive, manicured hand on his shoulder, patting him as if he were a well-trained pet. She looked down at me, her eyes burning with spiteful victory. "You heard your father," Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing in this family, Vivian. You are just a bitter, jealous footnote. You thought you could march in here and scare me with fake legal jargon. You thought you could steal my moment. But you failed. Now get out of my suite, and after today you will have nothing left to cry about." I slowly stood up, brushing a piece of lint from my navy skirt. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The deep aching betrayal I felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor. I had offered them mercy, and they arrogantly slapped it away. I looked at my father one last time, realizing that the man sitting in the wheelchair was a stranger. I looked at Brenda, memorizing the smug, victorious expression on her face, knowing it was the last time she would ever wear it. "I understand," I said simply. I gave a single resolute nod. I turned my back on them and walked out of the suite, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind me. The moral high ground was firmly secured. I had extended a lifeline, and they had chosen to drown. The anticipation singing in my veins was no longer laced with anxiety. It was pure, distilled adrenaline. I walked down the carpeted stairs toward the bustling auction floor, ready to pull the trigger on a trap my grandmother built a decade ago. I left the heavy mahogany door of the VIP suite closed behind me, stepping into the carpeted corridor that wrapped around the upper level of the building. The muffled, rhythmic pulse of the auction floor drifted upward, a steady hum of concentrated wealth and high-stakes commerce. I walked down the sweeping grand staircase, my hand trailing lightly against the polished brass railing. The air grew cooler as I descended, carrying the crisp, distinct scent of expensive cologne, fresh floral arrangements, and old paper. The main floor of Sterling and Hayes was a theater designed for consumption. The architecture was imposing, featuring soaring ceilings trimmed in gold leaf and towering pillars of white marble. Hundreds of plush crimson velvet chairs were arranged in perfect symmetrical rows, facing a raised oak stage. Every single seat was filled. This was the premier event of the season, drawing elite private collectors, proxy bidders for international billionaires and prominent Dallas socialites. The room buzzed with a sophisticated electric anticipation. Buyers murmured to one another, studying their glossy auction catalogs, flipping pages with practiced clinical precision. I stood in the shadows near the back entrance, watching the stage. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and a hush fell over the sprawling room. Two armed security guards in dark tailored suits stepped into the harsh glare of the halogen spotlights. They flanked a custom reinforced glass display case, wheeling it slowly to the exact center of the stage. The overhead lights shifted, angling downward to illuminate the contents of the case. A collective, audible breath swept through the crowd. There, resting on beds of dark green velvet, was the Victoria Morgan Heritage Collection. The brilliant cut stones fractured the intense stage lighting, casting thousands of tiny prismatic reflections across the darkened walls of the ballroom. I recognized every single piece. I saw the platinum chandelier earrings missing the single vintage backing that currently sat in my coat pocket back in Austin. I saw the heavy emerald-cut sapphire pendant my grandmother purchased the day she finalized her first successful commercial land lease. I saw the delicate diamond tennis bracelet she wore to my high school graduation. It was not just a collection of precious minerals and refined metals. It was a physical timeline of a woman who carved an empire out of the unforgiving Texas dirt. And now her grit, her survival, and her triumph were being packaged and presented as a shiny commodity for strangers to purchase. I shifted my gaze from the stage to the front row of the audience. The prime seating was reserved exclusively for high-profile consignors and elite VIPs. Brenda had abandoned the quiet isolation of the upstairs suite, unable to resist the magnetic pull of the spotlight. She sat dead center in the front row, her crimson-tailored pantsuit standing out sharply against the sea of dark tuxedos. Madison sat directly to her right, wearing a shimmering silver cocktail dress, her legs crossed at the ankle. They were practically glowing with unearned triumph. A prominent local socialite leaned over the aisle, whispering something to Brenda. Brenda threw her head back and laughed, a bright musical sound that carried over the quiet chatter of the room. She tapped her champagne flute against the socialite's glass, accepting early congratulations for a sale that had not yet occurred. Madison wore a smug, entitled grin, sipping her drink and scanning the crowd, likely calculating how many more designer handbags she could buy by the end of the week. They were basking in the glow of my grandmother's diamonds, entirely oblivious to the federal snare closing tightly around their ankles. A tall, charismatic man with silver hair stepped up to the main wooden podium on the stage. He adjusted his silk tie and tapped the microphone. The dull thud echoed through the speakers, instantly silencing the remaining chatter in the room. He was the head auctioneer, the maestro tasked with extracting the highest possible bids from the wealthy audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice rich and commanding, rolling over the crowd with practiced theatricality. "We now arrive at the premier lot of the morning. It is a rare privilege to present a collection of this magnitude and historical pedigree. You have all read your catalogs. You know the history. This is the private, untouched estate collection of the late Victoria Morgan, a true pioneer of Texas commerce." He gestured gracefully toward the illuminated glass case. "For decades, these exceptional pieces have been held in a private family vault, unseen by the public eye. The craftsmanship is pristine. The provenance is impeccable. The stones you see before you are not merely flawless gems. They represent a legacy of American ambition. Today, one of you will have the unique opportunity to claim that legacy for your own family." The irony of his words tasted like ash. He was selling the romance of my grandmother's fierce independence, praising her ambition, while the scavengers who despised her sat in the front row preparing to cash the check. "We will open the bidding for the entire Victoria Morgan collection at a starting price of $750,000. The auctioneer announced, his gaze sweeping across the room, waiting for the first paddle to rise. "Do I have 750,000? The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. Bidders adjusted their posture, their hands hovering near their numbered placards. I did not wait for the first bid to register. I gripped the carved walnut box in my right hand. The dark wood was smooth against my palm, but the deep red wax seal pressed firmly against my skin, a cold, hard reminder of the power I carried. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center aisle. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, every sensory detail magnifying in the quiet, cavernous space. The thick crimson carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, but the steady, rhythmic drumming of my heart filled my ears. I heard the sharp clinking of ice inside crystal glasses. I heard the crisp rustle of thick paper as buyers flipped to the correct page in their catalogs. I smelled the heavy, cloying mixture of expensive floral perfumes and polished leather. A security guard stationed halfway down the aisle noticed my approach. He stepped into the center of the walkway, holding up a large gloved hand to halt my progress, silently warning me that movement during an active bid was strictly prohibited. I did not break my stride. I reached into my small vintage clutch with my free hand, retrieved the platinum proxy credential Julian had provided, and held it up. The embossed silver foil caught the overhead light. The guard's eyes darted down to the security watermark. He recognized the highest level of legal clearance the auction house issued. He immediately dropped his hand, stepped backward, and blended into the rows of velvet chairs, leaving the center aisle entirely clear. I kept walking, my posture rigid, my gaze locked on the front of the room. I was not aiming for the auctioneer on the main stage. I was aiming for the secondary desk flanking the left side of the platform. This smaller, understated mahogany desk belonged to the managing director and head appraiser of Sterling & Hayes, Mr. Sterling himself. He was the man responsible for verifying the legal integrity of every single transaction that occurred under his roof. He sat behind a stack of thick legal dossiers, wearing a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, monitoring the floor to ensure compliance with international trade regulations. He was the architect of the auction, and he was my target. I closed the distance, passing row after row of wealthy buyers. As I reached the third row, the peripheral movement caught Madison's attention. She was raising her champagne glass to take a sip when she turned her head. Her eyes locked onto me. The smug, entitled grin vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Her hand froze in midair. The crystal flute tilted dangerously, spilling a few drops of pale gold liquid onto the sleeve of her shimmering silver dress. Brenda noticed her daughter's sudden paralysis. She followed Madison's panicked stare, turning her head toward the center aisle. When Brenda saw me walking toward the front of the room, the color rushed out of her face. She gripped the armrests of her velvet chair, her knuckles turning bone white. She opened her mouth likely to shout for security, but the sheer calculated calm of my approach paralyzed her. She realized in that agonizing span of seconds that her intimidation tactics in the VIP suite had failed. I had not gone back to Austin. I had not surrendered to her eviction notice. I was standing on her meticulously constructed stage carrying a dark wooden box she had never seen before. I ignored their terrified stares. I walked past the front row, stepping out of the center aisle and moving directly toward the left side of the stage. The auctioneer raised his hand, pointing toward a buyer in the back. "I have 750,000, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Do I hear 800? I reached the edge of the secondary podium. Mr. Sterling looked up from his thick legal dossiers, peering over the rim of his glasses, his brow furrowing in polite confusion as I encroached upon his restricted workspace. The heavy red wax seal dug into my palm, ready to shatter the illusion of Brenda's stolen empire. I stepped up to the secondary mahogany podium, leaving the center aisle behind me. Mr. William Sterling sat behind his towering stacks of legal dossiers, a silver pen poised above a ledger. William Sterling was an institution in the Dallas art and antiquities market. He had spent 4 decades building a reputation founded on strict compliance, impeccable provenance, and airtight legal integrity. His auction house was trusted by international billionaires because he personally verified the title of every single item that crossed his stage. A single clouded title or a disputed inheritance could ruin his corporate operating license. He was a man who traded in certainty. He looked up as I approached, his brow furrowing. He adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, clearly annoyed by the breach in protocol. The secondary podium was strictly off-limits during an active bidding session. "Can I help you, madam?" he whispered, keeping his voice low so he would not disrupt the head auctioneer who was currently working the crowd just a few feet away. "You need to return to your seat immediately." I did not apologize. I did not step back. I reached out and placed the carved walnut box directly onto the center of his desk, right on top of his open ledger. The heavy wood made a dull, solid thud against the mahogany surface. Mr. Sterling stared at the box, his irritation shifting into a guarded curiosity. I placed my hand on the intricate floral lid and flipped it open. I reached into my vintage clutch, retrieved the heavy leather legal folio Julian Pierce had prepared, and set it down next to the box. I flipped the folio open to the first page, exposing the thick black header of the Victoria Morgan Irrevocable Heritage Trust, complete with its array of official notary stamps and state verification seals. "Please look inside this box, Mr. Sterling," I instructed, my voice calm but laced with an undeniable authority. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his professional instincts warring with his frustration. But the sheer confidence of my demand won. He leaned forward and looked down into the velvet-lined compartment of the walnut box. His eyes locked onto the deep red wax seal. I watched the exact moment his world tilted on its axis. The healthy flush of color drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His mouth parted slightly, the silver pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the desk. William Sterling had been working in the Texas estate market long enough to remember my grandmother. He had handled appraisals for Victoria 30 years ago when she first began acquiring her most valuable pieces. He recognized the Morgan family crest pressed into the wax, the solitary star surrounded by twisting oak leaves. More importantly, he knew exactly what a registered family trust seal signified in the world of high-end asset liquidations. In the elite auction industry, a registered physical seal supersedes any standard estate affidavit, any verbal agreement, and any power of attorney. It is the ultimate reigning authority of ownership. Mr. Sterling knew that without this specific piece of wax and my matching notarized signature, the jewelry sparkling under the stage lights was legally paralyzed. His eyes darted from the red wax seal to the open legal folio. He read the bold header. He saw the signature of Julian Pierce, a ruthless estate litigator the auction house kept on retainer for hostile disputes. Mr. Sterling knew Julian Pierce did not send proxies or draft injunctions unless the blood was already in the water and the legal trap was inescapable. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed over him in real time. His prestigious auction house had not just accepted a consignment from an unauthorized seller. They had wired a $250,000 cash advance across state lines to a woman who possessed a forged title. They had facilitated a federal wire fraud scheme, and they were currently attempting to sell stolen property to the wealthiest families in the state. Madam, Mr. Sterling stammered, his voice trembling as he looked up at me, his professional composure shattering into raw panic. Where did you get this? Who is the current consignor of this lot? Before I could answer, the booming voice of the head auctioneer echoed through the ballroom speakers, filling the space with mounting tension. I have 850,000 from the gentleman in the fourth row, the auctioneer called out, raising his wooden gavel into the air. Do I hear 900? We are at $850,000, going once. The hammer was about to fall. In a matter of seconds, the stolen diamonds would be legally bound to an innocent buyer, plunging the situation into a nightmare of contested funds and international asset freezing. Mr. Sterling was too paralyzed by shock to act. His hands were shaking over the legal folio, his mind short-circuiting as he tried to process the catastrophic liability unfolding on his stage. I did not wait for him to find his courage. Resting on the right side of his mahogany desk was a flexible gooseneck microphone. It was a dedicated PA line used by the floor directors to make emergency announcements or clarify lot conditions to the entire room. I stepped around the edge of the podium. I reached out, grabbed the slender metal neck of the microphone, and pulled it directly toward my face. I pressed the activation button on the base. A sharp electronic click broadcasted over the massive ballroom speakers, instantly cutting through the smooth, practiced cadence of the head auctioneer. I leaned into the microphone. I looked directly past the stage lights, fixing my gaze on the center of the front row, right where Brenda sat in her tailored crimson suit. Those pieces are stolen trust property, I stated, my voice echoing across the cavernous room, cold, steady, and amplified to a deafening volume. And the seller sitting in the front row has no legal right to them. I released the button. The resulting silence was not just quiet. It was a physical force. It dropped over the grand ballroom like a heavy lead curtain. The string quartet in the corner stopped playing mid-measure, resulting in a harsh, discordant screech of a bow against a cello string. The head auctioneer froze with his wooden gavel held high in the air, his mouth hanging open, his eyes darting toward the secondary podium in utter confusion. The wealthy buyers in the audience lowered their numbered placards. The rhythmic rustling of catalogs ceased. Hundreds of billionaires, socialites, and proxy bidders sat frozen in their plush velvet chairs, processing the bomb I had just detonated in the middle of their exclusive Saturday morning event. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda. She was rigid, her spine pressed hard against the back of her chair. The smug, victorious glow she had worn mere minutes ago was entirely extinguished. She looked like a driver who had just realized her brakes were cut while speeding toward a concrete wall. Her eyes were wide, staring up at me, with a mixture of disbelief and pure, suffocating terror. Madison sat beside her, the spilled champagne soaking into her silver dress, unnoticed, her jaw slack, as she stared at her mother, waiting for a defense that would never come. The tension in the ballroom stretched to a breaking point. The elite crowd realized they had just been invited to bid on the proceeds of a felony. The collective shock morphed into a heavy, judging scrutiny. Every single head in the room slowly turned away from the stage and pivoted toward the front row. The Dallas high society Brenda had spent 10 years trying to impress was now staring at her not as an equal, but as a criminal trespasser who had tried to defraud them. The payoff struck with devastating precision. The trap my grandmother built a decade ago had finally snapped shut, executing its purpose flawlessly in the brightest possible light. Brenda was exposed. Mr. Sterling slowly pushed himself up from his chair. His face was still pale, but the shock was rapidly transitioning into a cold corporate survival instinct. He looked at the carved wooden box, then looked out at his audience of wealthy clients, knowing he had to take immediate control of the floor before his corporate reputation suffered irreversible damage. He reached for his own microphone, preparing to address the crowd and demand answers from the woman in the crimson suit, setting the stage for a public reckoning that Brenda could not escape. The echoes of my voice faded into the heavy velvet curtains, but the weight of my words pinned every single person in the room to their seats. The silence was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning units working to cool the massive ballroom. The head auctioneer remained frozen on the main stage, his wooden gavel suspended in midair, his eyes darting between the illuminated glass display case and the secondary podium where I stood. William Sterling pressed the activation button on his own desk microphone. The sharp electronic click sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He stood up, towering over his stacks of legal dossiers. The shock that had paralyzed him moments ago was entirely gone. In its place was a cold, unforgiving corporate survival instinct. He was a man whose entire livelihood depended on trust, and he had just realized his firm was being used to fence a stolen empire. Mrs. Morgan Sterling said, his voice booming over the speakers. It was no longer the polite, deferential murmur of a customer service professional. It was the hard, exacting tone of a director protecting a multi-million-dollar institution. Please stand up. Brenda did not move at first. She was glued to her crimson velvet chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The Dallas socialite sitting next to her slowly pulled her arm away, putting a few inches of distance between them. I am going to ask you a direct question, Sterling continued, his gaze locked onto Brenda like a targeting laser. Were you aware that the jewelry currently displayed on my stage belongs to an irrevocable trust? The direct public confrontation finally broke Brenda from her paralysis. She scrambled to her feet. Her knee caught the edge of her chair, knocking it backward into the knees of the wealthy investor sitting behind her. She did not apologize. She did not even look at the man she hit. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "She is lying!" Brenda shrieked. Her voice cracked, stripping away every ounce of the refined, wealthy persona she had spent the last 10 years cultivating. She is a sick, delusional girl. She is my estranged stepdaughter. She has a history of severe mental breakdowns and gambling addictions. She is just trying to extort me because she is jealous of my inheritance. The guests in the front rows shifted uncomfortably. A few people murmured, exchanging bewildered glances. Brenda was relying on the exact same playbook she used when she called my boss at the veterinary clinic. She thought she could shout down the truth by attacking my character. She thought volume and theatrical outrage would be enough to sway a room full of strangers. "My husband signed the transfer papers," Brenda yelled, turning her frantic gaze toward the audience, pleading for an ally. "David Morgan signed the affidavit. You all saw the catalog. The estate belongs to me. She is a fraud. Someone call security and have her arrested." Sterling did not call security to remove me. He simply reached down and picked up the heavy leather folio Julian Pierce had prepared. He held it up under the stage lights for the entire room to see. Madam Sterling interrupted, his amplified voice easily, overpowering her frantic shouting. "I do not care about your family disputes. I care about the legal title of the assets on my stage." The woman standing next to me did not just present a wild accusation. She presented a verified, notarized legal folio proving she is the sole trustee of the Victoria Morgan estate. Brenda stopped talking. Her jaw trembled. Sterling set the folio down and picked up the carved walnut box. He turned it toward the audience, ensuring the deep red wax seal was visible. She also presented a registered family authentication mark. Sterling announced, his tone dripping with professional disgust. "I have worked in this industry for 40 years. I personally handled acquisitions for Victoria Morgan. I recognize this seal. I know exactly what it means. It means the contract you signed with my firm is counterfeit. It means the estate affidavit you provided was fabricated." A collective audible gasp rippled through the audience. 300 Dallas elites, people who spent their lives navigating complex trusts and corporate law, instantly understood the magnitude of the situation. Forging a title document to secure a cash advance from a major financial entity was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a severe felony. "No?" Brenda whispered, shaking her head. The microphone picked up her frantic denial. "No, you do not understand. David gave it to me. I am his wife. This lot is officially seized," Sterling declared, ignoring her entirely. He turned toward the armed security detail flanking the perimeter of the ballroom. "Secure the display case. Lock the doors. Nobody touches those diamonds until the authorities arrive. We are initiating a full federal investigation for interstate title fraud and wire theft." The public execution of her ego was absolute. Brenda had walked into this ballroom feeling like a queen. She wanted an audience to witness her triumph, to validate her wealth, and to cement her status among the aristocracy. Now that exact same audience was watching her get dismantled on a live microphone. The social recoil was immediate and devastating. The prominent oil tycoon she had been laughing with just moments ago stood up, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and moved 3 seats down the aisle, looking at her as if she carried a highly contagious disease. The surrounding socialites turned their backs. The whispers started. They were not quiet murmurs. They were sharp, judging, unforgiving comments about the woman in the crimson suit who tried to con them all. Brenda looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single sympathetic expression. She found none. The high society she worshipped was rejecting her in real time. Her pristine facade crumbled into dust. She looked small, terrified, and utterly alone. Then a sudden sharp sound cut through the murmuring crowd. It was the sound of shattering glass. Madison had dropped her crystal champagne flute. It smashed against the hardwood floor, sending glittering shards and pale gold liquid across the toes of her designer shoes. Madison looked down at her shimmering silver dress. She looked at her mother, who was currently hyperventilating in the aisle. The reality of the situation finally breached Madison's sheltered, entitled mind. The $250,000 advance, the shopping spree in downtown Austin, the brand-new chalk-gray Porsche Macan sitting in the hotel parking garage with temporary dealer tags. She realized the money did not come from a legitimate business deal. It came from a crime. Madison realized she was wearing the proceeds of a federal felony. She realized the luxury vehicle she had driven to the country club was going to be seized as criminal evidence. Her wealthy boyfriend, her status, her entire curated lifestyle were funded by a forged document. Madison burst into loud, hysterical tears. She did not cry because she felt remorse for stealing my grandmother's legacy. She cried out of pure self-preservation. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her impending bankruptcy washed over her. "Mom, what did you do?" Madison sobbed, her voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "What did you do to us?" Brenda reached out to comfort her daughter, but Madison flinched, taking a step backward, refusing to be touched by the woman who had just dragged them both into a federal indictment. I stood at the secondary podium watching the destruction unfold. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I had offered Brenda a quiet exit just an hour ago in the VIP suite. I gave her the chance to return the advance and walk away with her dignity intact. She laughed in my face and told me I was nothing. Now she was standing in the exact spotlight she demanded, reaping the exact harvest she had planted. The head auctioneer stepped down from the main stage, retreating into the shadows to distance himself from the scandal. 2 broad-shouldered security guards marched down the center aisle. They did not head toward me. They headed directly for Brenda. "Mrs. Morgan," one of the guards said, his voice firm and commanding, "we need you to step out of the ballroom and accompany us to the manager's office. Now!" Brenda looked at the guards, then looked up at me. Her eyes were red, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. The hatred in her stare was visceral, but the power behind it was entirely gone. She was a scavenger who had finally been caught in the trap. Sterling turned off his microphone. He looked at me, giving a slow, respectful nod. He signaled the floor director to clear the room. The auction was over. The guests began to filter out of the rows, whispering frantically, pulling out their cell phones to spread the scandal across the city. Brenda was escorted out of the ballroom by the security team, her head bowed, her daughter trailing behind her, weeping uncontrollably. I picked up the carved walnut box, preparing to follow them into the back office, ready to watch the final financial ruin of my stepmother take shape. I followed the security detail through a discreet side door, leaving the chaotic hum of the grand ballroom behind. The transition was jarring. We stepped into a sterile, brightly lit corridor that led deep into the administrative wing of Sterling and Hayes. The glamorous illusion of high society vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of corporate law. At the end of the hallway, a heavy frosted glass door swung open. The guards escorted Brenda and Madison inside, motioning for my father to follow in his wheelchair. I stepped over the threshold, the door clicking shut behind me, sealing us inside the executive conference room. The space was designed for intimidation. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the table. Beside him stood a tall man wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, holding a sleek leather portfolio. This was the head of corporate litigation for the auction house. He did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply opened his portfolio, extracting the consignment contracts and the forged estate affidavit, spreading them methodically across the polished wood surface. Brenda stood on the opposite side of the table, her crimson suit wrinkled, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Madison huddled in the far corner, wiping her tear-streaked face with the back of her trembling hand, the glittering silver fabric of her dress looking absurd in the harsh fluorescent lighting. My father parked his wheelchair near the window. His shaking hands gripped the armrests, his gaze locked onto the fraudulent documents displayed before him. The litigation director spoke with the clinical detached precision of a surgeon amputating a corrupted limb. He informed Brenda that she was in catastrophic breach of a binding legal contract. By providing a fabricated title of ownership, she had triggered the severe penalty clauses embedded within the fine print. The auction house was formally demanding the immediate return of their $250,000 cash advance. The lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the table, tapping his silver pen against the bottom line. He stated that the funds must be wired back into their corporate holding account by the close of business on Monday. If the transfer failed to clear, he explained Sterling and Hayes would hand the forged affidavit directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They would file a civil suit for damages, and they would push for a grand larceny indictment. Brenda stared at the demand letter, the remaining color draining from her face, until her skin mirrored the pale hue of parchment. Her voice shook as she confessed the terrifying truth. She admitted the money was already gone. She confessed she spent the entire advance within 24 hours, purchasing designer clothing and a custom luxury vehicle for her daughter. The corporate attorney did not blink. He coldly explained that elite auction houses do not accept depreciating physical assets as financial reimbursement. A sports car loses a significant fraction of its retail value the second its tires touch the public pavement. He demanded liquid capital. Brenda was instantly bankrupt. The realization hit her like a physical blow, buckling her knees. She had no personal savings, no independent income, and her husband's business accounts were frozen due to his medical incapacitation. She had gambled her entire future on a stolen legacy, and the house had just collected her chips. My father finally found his voice. The thick fog of manipulation that had clouded his judgment for a decade lifted, revealing the stark, ugly reality of his marriage. He looked at the forged signature on the estate affidavit, tracing the counterfeit letters with his weary eyes. He turned his head slowly, fixing his gaze on the woman he had married. He realized Brenda had used his stroke as a convenient, calculated smokescreen to execute a felony. She had checked him out of a hospital ward, risking his fragile health simply because she needed him present to legitimize her counterfeit narrative. She was perfectly willing to let him take the fall as the estate executor if her scheme unraveled. My father saw the ruthless predator my grandmother had warned him about all those years ago. David looked at me, his only loyal daughter, the child he had ordered to leave his hospital room just hours earlier. Tears welled in his eyes as he recognized the staggering magnitude of his failure. He had alienated the only person who genuinely cared about his survival, trading my devotion for the shallow affection of a thief. "I am sorry, Vivian," my father whispered, his raspy voice breaking under the weight of his profound shame. I did not see it. I should have listened to you. I did not respond. An apology born from the ashes of a ruined reputation felt remarkably hollow. With her financial ruin cemented and her husband finally turning his back, Brenda abandoned her pride entirely. The haughty aristocratic persona she had paraded around the Dallas ballroom shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She fell to her knees on the expensive carpet, crawling the short distance toward where I stood near the closed door. She reached out with shaking hands, grabbing the hem of my navy silk dress, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears ruined her meticulously applied makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks running down her cheeks. "Vivian, please." Brenda begged, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. "You have to drop the trust claims. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please do not let them send me to federal prison. We are family. I will find a way to pay the money back. I promise you I will work for the rest of my life to repay the debt. Just sign the release papers. Save us." It was a pathetic, degrading display. A week ago, this sight might have stirred a flicker of pity within my chest. But the trials of the past few days had forged a cold, impenetrable armor around my heart. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet, feeling a profound, chilling clarity. "You handed me a formal eviction notice on my front porch yesterday morning," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, entirely devoid of sympathy. "You called my boss and tried to destroy my professional career by labeling me a psychotic addict. You stole my grandmother's history while my father was lying in an intensive care unit fighting for his life." I took a deliberate step backward, pulling the fabric of my dress out of her desperate grasp. "We are not family, Brenda," I stated firmly. "You are just a scavenger who finally got caught in a trap. I will not sign a release, and I will not save you from the consequences of your own greed." The reversal of power was complete. The toxic dynamic that had suffocated my existence for 10 long years was permanently shattered, realigned in my favor. Brenda collapsed onto the floor, weeping into her hands, realizing her fate was sealed. Madison remained frozen in the corner, staring at her mother in disgusted horror. As the litigation director gathered his documents preparing to initiate the federal asset recovery protocols, he made a passing comment to Mr. Sterling. He mentioned that their legal team would need to review the remaining clauses within the Victoria Morgan Trust to ensure there were no other encumbered properties linked to the forged affidavit. A quiet, electric realization sparked in my mind. I had been so intensely focused on rescuing the jewelry collection that I had barely processed the secondary stipulations my grandmother had woven into the dense legal folio. The trust did not merely hold the title to the diamonds. It encompassed a broader scope of Victoria's original assets. The stage was perfectly set for the final devastating boundary, one that would secure my freedom the moment I returned to the Texas Hill Country. The drive back to Austin from Dallas felt like waking up from a long, suffocating fever dream. I did not travel alone. Julian Pierce arranged for a private armed security courier to transport the Victoria Morgan collection straight from the auction house floor back to the Texas Heritage Trust and Savings Bank. I sat in the passenger seat of his sleek sedan, watching the rolling hills of the countryside blur past the window. The oppressive, lingering dread that had shadowed my every step over the past week was gone. It was replaced by a profound, quiet stillness. When we arrived at the downtown bank, the senior vault manager was waiting for us. We walked down the hushed subterranean corridor, retracing the steps I had taken just a few days prior. I watched as the armed guards transferred the velvet display cases from their locked transport containers back into the heavy metal drawer. I placed the carved walnut box beside them, the deep red wax seal resting securely in the dark. The manager slid the drawer into the wall, turning the dual keys. The heavy steel lock engaged with a resounding, satisfying click. My grandmother's legacy was finally safe anchored in a fortress where Brenda could never reach it. But Julian was not finished. He asked me to follow him back to his high-rise office overlooking the Colorado River. When we stepped into his suite, he gestured toward the mahogany desk, where the thick leather folio remained open. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, handing one to me with a sharp, calculating smile. "We secured the physical assets," Julian stated, taking a seat and adjusting his suit jacket. But during my review of the secondary clauses yesterday evening, I uncovered a brilliant structural maneuver your grandmother embedded deep within the trust. Victoria did not merely protect her jewelry, Vivian, she protected the ground you walk on. I set my glass down, a new wave of anticipation tightening my focus. What do you mean? Julian turned to the final section of the legal folio, tapping his silver pen against a notarized land deed. 5 years ago, Victoria transferred the deed to the 40-acre Morgan Ranch into a holding entity controlled exclusively by this trust. She granted your father a conditional life tenancy. He was permitted to reside on the property rent-free provided he maintained the integrity of the estate and protected its assets. Julian leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. By actively facilitating the theft of the trust's primary assets, your father violated the core stipulation of his tenancy. He forfeited his right to reside on the property. Furthermore, Brenda's name is nowhere on the title. When she handed you that 30-day notice to vacate the guest cabin, she was threatening you with imaginary authority. She never owned the dirt she stood on. You are the sole managing director of the holding entity. You own the ranch. The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train. For 10 years, I had paid market-rate rent to my own father, believing I was a guest on his land. I had endured Brenda's constant threats, terrified that she held the power to render me homeless. All the while, I was the legal landlord. Victoria had woven a safety net so vast and intricate that it caught every single piece of my falling world. The following morning, I drove through the iron gates of the ranch. The landscape looked entirely different to me now. The rolling green pastures, the ancient pecan trees, the wooden fences I had mended with my own hands, they all belonged to me. I parked my faded sedan in the main driveway. The chalk gray luxury sports car was conspicuously missing. The dealership had already dispatched a recovery team to repossess the vehicle after the auction house flagged the fraudulent wire transfer. I walked up the front steps and opened the heavy oak door. The interior of the grand house was in utter chaos. Cardboard moving boxes were scattered across the foyer. The expensive floral perfume that usually choked the air was overpowered by the sharp, acidic scent of pure panic. I found Brenda and David in the living room. Brenda was pacing frantically across the Persian rug, clutching her cell phone, leaving desperate voicemails for criminal defense attorneys. She needed a legal shield, but top-tier defense firms demanded exorbitant retainers cash she no longer possessed. David sat slumped on the leather sofa, looking 10 years older than he had in Dallas. He stared at the cold fireplace, a broken, defeated shell of a man. Brenda stopped pacing the second I entered the room. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face drawn and haggard. The arrogant predator was gone, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. Vivian, Brenda gasped, rushing toward me, her voice trembling. You have to help us. Sterling and Hayes filed their civil claim this morning. The federal investigators are subpoenaing my bank records. I'm going to be arrested. She reached out, attempting to grab my hands, but I took a deliberate step backward, keeping a wide, sterile distance between us. Please, she begged, tears spilling over her eyelashes. Just authorize the sale of one necklace. Just one piece. It will cover the advance and pay for my legal fees. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave the state. Just do not let them put me in a cage. I looked at the woman who had tried to incinerate my career, who had called my boss to brand me a psychotic addict, who had gleefully handed me an eviction notice when she thought she held all the cards. I will not spend a single dime of my grandmother's legacy to fund your criminal defense, I replied, my voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling, cold and unyielding. You took a gamble with my history, Brenda. Now you get to pay the house. I reached into my purse, retrieved a crisp manila folder, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. That is a formal notice to vacate, I stated. Julian drafted it this morning. You violated the terms of the trust tenancy. You have 72 hours to pack whatever you purchased with legitimate funds and leave my property. If you are still inside this house on Thursday morning, the local sheriff will escort you off the premises for criminal trespassing. My father looked up from the sofa. His lower lip trembled. He tried to stand, his weakened legs shaking under his diminished weight. Vivian, please. He rasped, tears tracking through the deep lines on his face. This is your childhood home. You cannot throw your own father out into the street. I made a terrible mistake. I am so sorry. I love you." I stared at him, feeling a strange, hollow detachment. I searched my chest for a flicker of grief, a spark of the daughter who used to worship the ground he walked on. There was nothing left. His cowardice had extinguished the final embers of my devotion. "You stopped being a father the day you let her raid that safe," I told him, my tone devoid of anger settling into a flat, undeniable truth. "You chose your comfort over my survival. You enabled a thief because it was easier than standing up for your own blood. You are reaping the exact harvest you planted." David opened his mouth to speak, reaching a trembling hand in my direction, pleading for a grace he had never earned. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument. I remained firmly silent. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket right in front of them. I opened my contact list, tapped his name, and hit block. I scrolled down to Brenda, blocked her number, and did the same for Madison. The digital severing was immediate and permanent. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and let the heavy wood slam shut behind me. 3 weeks have passed since that morning. The ranch is quiet now. Brenda was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and interstate theft. Without the funds to secure high-powered representation, she accepted a plea deal that guarantees she will spend the next several years sitting in a federal facility. Madison moved into a cramped studio apartment in a neighboring city, forced to work double shifts at a retail store just to afford her rent. My father relocated to a modest assisted living facility, his medical bills consuming whatever legitimate savings he had left. They are gone. Tonight, I am sitting on the wraparound porch of the main house. The Texas evening is warm, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of blooming jasmine and damp soil. The sky is painted in deep streaks of violet and burnt orange, the sun dipping below the rolling hills. I reach up and touch my right earlobe. Resting securely against my skin is the vintage platinum earring back I found on the hallway runner rug, now reunited with the brilliant chandelier diamond it belongs to. I wear them not as a display of wealth, but as a quiet physical reminder of the woman who fought to secure my future. My grandmother Victoria knew that family is not defined by blood alone. Blood can be a chain just as easily as it can be a bond. She knew that some people view love as a transactional currency, using guilt and obligation to drain the life from those who care about them. She built a door I could walk through, but I had to find the courage to turn the key. If you are listening to this story on Calm Senior Stories and you find yourself shrinking to make a toxic family member comfortable, I need you to hear this. You do not owe your abusers your silence. You do not owe an enabler your forgiveness. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of basic survival. When people show you they are willing to dismantle your life to elevate their own, believe them. Stop waiting for the apology that will never come. Stop trying to earn respect from people who view you as property. Build your own fortress. Find your own truth. You deserve to live in the light, and you deserve to hold the keys to your own legacy. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience. Leave a comment sharing a time you had to stand up for yourself. Take care of your heart, protect your peace, and never apologize for surviving. The Texas Hill Country has a way of stripping things down to their barest truth. When the evening wind sweeps across the long grass at dusk, it doesn't leave room for polite fictions or manicured lies. Sitting on this wraparound porch, listening to the absolute quiet settling over the ranch, I finally understand the profound lesson my grandmother Victoria was trying to teach me all those years ago. In American culture, we are often sold a very specific, sanitized version of family. We are told that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract that demands our endless loyalty, our quiet suffering, and our constant forgiveness. We are taught to turn the other cheek, to keep the peace at Sunday dinners, and to shrink ourselves so that the loudest, most entitled voices in the room can feel big. But Victoria, a woman who carved her own American dream out of the unforgiving dirt, knew that blood can sometimes be the very thing that poisons the well. She understood that there are people who view love not as a mutual embrace, but as a transactional currency leveraging guilt to drain the life from those who care about them. The greatest inheritance my grandmother left me wasn't a collection of platinum chandelier earrings or a heavy sapphire pendant. It wasn't the $1 million appraisal or the deed to 40 acres of prime real estate. Her true legacy was the blueprint for an impenetrable boundary. She left me the undeniable proof that setting a boundary against toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, nor is it a betrayal of familial duty. It is the purest, most necessary act of self-preservation. We spend so much of our lives waiting for our abusers to suddenly wake up and apologize. We wait for the weak enablers like my father to finally find their spine and stand up for us. But the harsh, empowering truth is that you cannot wait for a rescue party that is never coming. You have to build your own fortress. You have to be willing to walk into the brightest, most terrifying room, look the scavengers in the eye, and reclaim the narrative they tried to steal. It requires an agonizing shedding of the hopeful child inside you, the one who just wanted a parent to choose them over a comfortable lie. Stories like this, narratives of generational trauma, hidden strength, and ultimate liberation are happening behind closed doors in every neighborhood in this country. It's why spaces that share these raw, unfiltered truths are so incredibly vital. If you found a piece of your own journey in my words today, I encourage you to subscribe and follow the channel Calm Senior Stories. We need to keep sharing these testaments of survival to remind each other that we are never as trapped as the scavengers want us to believe. The ranch is entirely mine now. The heavy oak doors are locked permanently to the people who once tried to push me out into the cold. Yet as the sun dips completely below the horizon, casting long dark shadows across the empty driveway, I am left with a lingering quiet question. I wear my grandmother's diamond, and I hold the deed. But sometimes I look at the empty chairs in the living room and wonder about the true cost of peace. When you finally cut away the rotting branches of your family tree, you are left standing tall, bathed in the light. But you are also left standing alone. And perhaps that is the ultimate paradox we all must face, that the price of total freedom is learning how to embrace the silence.